In 2012, I spent 2 weeks in the Vatican archives. What I saw there, they never let anyone publish. Spinoza was right about everything, and I'm going to show you the evidence they don't want you to see.
The most feared book in the Bible has already ended. Every war, every plague, every horseman, every number fulfilled. Spinoza proved it. The church has hidden this for 19 centuries. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Before I tell you what Spinoza found in the text, let me show you what the text actually says. Not what you were taught it says, what it says. The Book of Revelation is the most read and least understood document in the history of Western religion. People have spent centuries decoding it as a prophecy of future catastrophe, nuclear war, microchip implants, a coming antichrist, the end of the world as we know it. Every generation finds itself in those pages. Every crisis becomes the fulfillment. Every century has its candidates for the beast, and yet the end has not come. Not yet. That is the position the church has held for 1900 years. But here is the thing that Spinoza understood, and that no seminary taught me in the way it should have been taught. The Book of Revelation was not written for us. It was not written for any future generation. It was written in approximately 68 of the Common Era, addressed to 7 specific churches in Asia Minor, to people who were living under active Roman persecution, and it was written in a code so transparent to its original audience that they would have known immediately who the characters were, what the symbols meant, and when the events were expected to occur, not in some distant future, in their lifetime. I need you to stay with that, because what I am going to show you is not fringe scholarship. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented academic position that every serious New Testament scholar knows, and that almost no denomination teaches from a pulpit. And the name of the man who identified the mechanism of suppression, the reason this reading disappeared from church teaching, is Baruch Spinoza. There is a name, a number, a code that every first-century reader decoded in seconds, and that the church has spent 19 centuries making sure you cannot. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the beginning of the apocalypse, the beginning of how I came to understand it. I taught New Testament for nearly 20 years. Theology and philosophy of religion, Norwich, and before that a period at the University of East Anglia. I taught the Book of Revelation the way I was trained to teach it, as a complex prophetic text, layer upon layer of symbolic imagery, the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, the great whore and the beast, the 1,000-year reign and the New Jerusalem. I taught the standard scholarly options, futurist, preterist, historicist, idealist. I presented them as live debates. I was professionally even-handed. But I taught it, always within the assumption that the text's primary referent was some future horizon, that the drama described in those pages had not yet occurred, that the catastrophe still lay ahead. There are 3 things about Revelation that Spinoza identified that no seminary teaches in the way they deserve to be taught. I am going to give you all 3, but I need to start with the first one, because without it, the other 2 do not land. I remember an autumn morning in Norwich, one of those gray Tuesdays when the light through the seminary windows is more flat than cold, the kind of light that makes everything in the room look slightly tired. I was teaching a module on Revelation. It was the mid-80s. I had perhaps 15 students. The room smelled of instant coffee and photocopier toner. There was a radiator against the wall that ticked intermittently, the way old radiators do when they are deciding whether or not to provide heat. I was walking them through the symbolic imagery of chapter 13, the beast from the sea, the number 666, the mark without which no man could buy or sell. Their student in the 3rd row, not a particularly advanced student, someone I would have described as conscientious rather than brilliant, raised her hand and asked a question I had never been asked before. She said, "If the original readers couldn't understand it, who was it written for?" I started to answer in the mode I always used. I began to say something about prophetic mystery, about texts written for all times and all peoples, about the particular nature of apocalyptic literature. And somewhere in the middle of that answer I stopped, not because I had said something wrong, because I could feel quite distinctly that I was not answering her question, I was deflecting it. The question was specific and reasonable, and it had a shape that my standard answer did not fit. If the text was written in symbols that required centuries of interpretation, and that scholars still disagreed about, in what sense had it been written for those 7 churches in Asia Minor? What had it meant to them? What were they supposed to do with it? I continued the class. I do not think any of the students noticed that anything had shifted. I gave them their reading list. Someone asked about the word count for the assignment. The radiator ticked. People gathered their things and the room emptied in the ordinary way rooms empty after the last class of a Tuesday morning. But I left that room different from how I had entered it. Not dramatically different, just differently arranged. Like a drawer where something has been moved slightly and you cannot quite close it the same way. That is when I went back to the sources. Not to confirm what I had taught, to actually read what Revelation says and to whom and when. Now listen carefully, because this is where the first of Spinoza's 3 points becomes inescapable. The book of Revelation opens with letters addressed to 7 specific churches: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Real churches, real communities, real people living in real towns on the western coast of what is now Turkey in the 1st century of the Common Era. John of Patmos was not writing for an audience 1700 years in the future. He was writing to congregations he knew in a style they would recognize, the apocalyptic code language of resistance literature, a tradition well established among Jewish communities under imperial oppression. The book of Daniel uses the same technique. So does the book of Enoch. So do the Sibylline Oracles. When you were being crushed by an empire that controlled your mail and read your correspondence, you wrote in code. That was not mysticism. That was prudent. And the code that every 1st century reader deciphered in seconds. Franz Ferdinand Benary established this in 1830. The Papyrus manuscript tradition has supported it since. The number 666, written in Hebrew gematria, the system in which each letter carries a numerical value, spells the name Nero Caesar. Nero Caesar, the Greek form of the emperor's name. In Latin, Nero Caesar gives you 616, which is why Papyrus 115, the oldest surviving manuscript of Revelation, contains not 666, but 616. Not a copyist error. An alternate transliteration of the same name, the same target. 2 different scribal traditions encoding the same emperor. Every 1st century reader of these texts knew this immediately. They were living under his persecution. They did not need a decoder ring. The code was as obvious to them as a political cartoon is to us. The church has spent 19 centuries turning that transparency into opacity, turning a contemporary political reference into a timeless eschatological mystery. And the reason it did so is the reason Spinoza identified, and I will get to it. But first I need to show you Josephus. That is Nero, simple. You might think that is the end of it. It is not. It is the beginning. In a moment I am going to show you exactly where Josephus, a man who was there in Jerusalem in 70 AD, describes the events of Revelation 1 chapter at a time. But first the 7 kings. Revelation chapter 17 verses 9 through 11. The 7 heads of the beast are 7 kings, the text says. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes he will remain only a little while. 5 have fallen, 1 is. Written during the reign of a specific emperor. Which emperor? Count the emperors. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Vespasian. If you are writing in 68 to 69 of the Common Era, 5 have fallen, Augustus through Nero. And 1 is, which is Galba, whose reign lasted approximately 7 months before he was assassinated, the one who would come after, and remain only a little while, Vespasian, who stabilized the empire and ended the Jewish war. This matches the historical sequence with a precision that is not coincidental. It is the precision of a contemporary writer, encoding contemporary events in the language of prophecy, for a contemporary audience that would recognize every reference. Edward Royce, writing in the mid-19th century, was among the first mainstream biblical scholars to document this systematically. The identification of the beast with Nero, the 7 kings with the Julian-Claudian and Flavian dynasties, and Babylon with Rome is not a fringe position. It is the position of every serious New Testament scholar who reads the text in its first-century context. The word Babylon itself, used throughout Revelation as the name of the corrupt world city, appears in other Jewish texts of the same period, specifically the 4th book of Esdras and the Fifth Sibylline Oracle, both written after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, both using Babylon as an explicit code for Rome. This was not obscure, it was the standard vocabulary of Jewish resistance literature. And that is when it stopped being about academic interpretation for me. That is when it became something else entirely. But before I tell you what Josephus wrote, I need to show you the passage that changed everything. Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Luke chapter 21, verse 32. Mark chapter 13, verse 30. 3 Gospels. The same words, "This generation shall not pass away until all these things have taken place." The Greek word is genia, generation. The same word Matthew uses everywhere else in his Gospel to mean a human lifetime, 30 to 40 years. The same word Luke uses when he writes, "this wicked generation." Not this era, not this type of people. This generation, the people alive when these words were spoken. Spinoza noted this in his reading of the prophetic mode. A text that says, "this generation" and means something else is not a prophecy. It is an evasion. And Jesus, in all 3 synoptic Gospels, gives a specific and unambiguous temporal horizon for the events he describes. The destruction of the temple, the tribulation, the fulfillment of all these things within the lifetime of the people hearing the words. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, approximately 40 years after the crucifixion. This generation shall not pass away until all these things have taken place. It did not pass away. The prophecy was fulfilled on schedule. I came to understand the full weight of this through Josephus. Flavius Josephus, writing in 75 AD, his work known as Bellum Judaicum, the Jewish War. It is a first-hand account of the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman legions under Titus, beginning in 66 AD and culminating in the destruction of the temple in 70. Josephus was a Jewish general who defected to the Roman side. He was an eyewitness. He was there. I was reading the Bellum Judaicum one late afternoon in Norwich. I remember it clearly because it was summer, and the light through the study window was longer than usual. One of those evenings in July when it does not go dark until past 9. The desk lamp was already on, but unnecessary. I had a mug of tea on the desk that had gone cold before I noticed it. Papers from a completely different project were spread across the left side of the desk. I was reading Josephus for those other papers. I was not looking for revelation. I was not even thinking about revelation. And then I came to book 6. Josephus describes the siege in detail that is almost unbearable to read. The city surrounded and starved, the population reduced to eating shoe leather, then worse. The fires beginning in the outer courts of the temple, the priests dying at the altar. And then in the midst of the military and administrative history, Josephus inserts something extraordinary. He describes the omens and signs that preceded the fall, strange lights appearing over the temple at night, a great star resembling a sword hanging over the city, voices heard from within the sanctuary, a light so bright at Passover that it appeared to be day. I put the book down. I did not reach immediately for revelation. I sat for a moment in that July light that was refusing to dim, with the cold tea and the unnecessary lamp, feeling the particular sensation of 2 texts rearranging themselves into a single geography. There was no moment of triumph in it, no eureka, just the quiet sense of something slotting into place that had always been loose. The way you feel when you find the word you have been searching for, and the sentence suddenly holds. Then I opened Revelation, chapter 8, the sounding of the trumpets. Hail and fire mixed with blood, a star falling from heaven, darkness, voices, the sounding of 6, then 7 trumpets, each marking a catastrophe descending upon the inhabited world. The language is symbolic and cosmic, but the events, fire, darkness, celestial signs, voices from the sacred space, the destruction of a city, are not cosmic at all. They are the events that Josephus describes from the ground as a soldier and a historian between 66 and 70 of the Common Era. And Josephus was not reading Revelation. He was writing history. This generation shall not pass. The 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the destruction of the great city whose streets ran with blood, whose population was slaughtered and enslaved, whose temple was burned to the ground so thoroughly that, as Jesus had predicted in Matthew 24, not one stone was left upon another. That is the fulfillment, not in some future apocalypse, in the documented history of 70 AD, recorded by an eyewitness, corroborated by archaeology, coherent with the temporal horizon that Jesus himself had given. Here is what Spinoza understood that the councils of the 4th century could not afford to acknowledge. Here is why the futurist reading was not an accident. And here is what the document trail shows. By the middle of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The institution required a future judgment, a cosmic reckoning still to come, because that future judgment is the instrument of authority. A church whose apocalypse has already occurred is a church that has lost its most powerful tool. The fear of what is coming is infinitely more manageable than the history of what has passed. History can be examined. It can be argued with. It can be compared to the text and found to correspond or not to correspond. But a future catastrophe is permanently available as a threat. It never expires. It can be deployed against any generation, in any century, under any political circumstances. What I am about to tell you about why this reading was suppressed is, I want to be careful here. It changes the relationship between fear and faith in a way that is difficult to undo. Spinoza's method, as he applied it to the prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, was to ask a single question that the church had trained readers not to ask. Who wrote this? In what circumstances? For what audience? And what did they need that audience to believe? A prophet for Spinoza was not someone who saw the future. A prophet was someone with an unusually powerful moral and imaginative faculty who expressed in the symbolic language available to them the truth of their particular historical moment. When John of Patmos wrote Revelation, he was not encoding the 21st century. He was encoding the 1st century. He was writing to communities under persecution using the shared symbolic vocabulary of Jewish resistance literature, telling them that the beast that oppressed them would fall, that the city that had destroyed their temple would itself be destroyed, that their suffering would not be permanent. And it happened. Within the lifetime of the generation he was addressing. The beast fell, the city burned. The temple stones, as prophesied, did not remain one upon another. The church could not allow this reading, not because it was academically insupportable. It is, in fact, the most academically defensible reading, but because it was institutionally catastrophic. An apocalypse that has already occurred is not a source of fear. And fear, as Spinoza diagnosed in extraordinary detail, is the instrument of theological power. He wrote, carefully, in language that almost escaped the senses, that the function of institutional religion is not to liberate the mind, but to contain it, that the specific theological construction of a permanent eschatological threat is the most durable method ever devised for maintaining obedience. A population that fears the end of the world does not question the institution that claims authority over salvation. You might think that scholars, having known this for 2 centuries, is the conclusion. It is not. The conclusion is what they did with the knowledge. I had a conversation once that I have thought about often since. It was at a biblical studies conference in the north of England, sometime in the mid-90s. One of those conferences that takes place in a converted educational building, institutional carpet the color of old mustard, folding tables, bad coffee in polystyrene cups that leach their own flavor into whatever you put in them. I was in a corridor between sessions. The afternoon panels had just ended. Around me, people were moving toward a side room where tea had been set out. I had stopped at a window. The light outside was gray in particular, the way it is in the north in autumn. Not dark, not bright, just present, like a held breath. A colleague passed me. I did not know him well, but I knew his work. He was a specialist in 1st century Jewish eschatology, based at Cambridge. We had spoken briefly once or twice over the years. He stopped when he saw me, perhaps because I was standing still while everyone else was moving toward the T. I mentioned something about the preterist reading of Revelation chapter 17, the 7 kings, the identification of the beast, the fulfillment in 70 AD. I said it tentatively, as one does when testing whether a colleague will engage or dismiss. He looked at me for a moment, sideways almost, the way people look when they are deciding how much to say. And then he said something that I cannot reconstruct verbatim, but whose substance I remember precisely. He said that every serious New Testament scholar who has worked in first-century sources knows this is the most defensible reading of the text. He said it is not a minority position among specialists. He said the question is not what the text says. He said, the question is what happens to a congregation when you say it from a pulpit. Then he went to get his tea. The conference noise returned. People moved around me in the corridor. I stood there with that sentence suspended in the air where he had left it. The question is, what happens to a congregation when you say it from a pulpit? What happens is this. If the apocalypse has already occurred, if the beast was Nero, if Babylon was Rome, if the 7 kings are documented emperors, if the destruction described was the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, if the generation Jesus addressed lived to see the fulfillment, then the institution that has maintained 19 centuries of eschatological terror has been maintaining it in the full knowledge that the text does not require it. R.C. Sproul, a mainstream Reformed theologian, not a liberal critic, not a secular historian, argued this extensively in his work on the last days. He was not writing from the fringes. He was a respected voice within evangelical scholarship, and his conclusion was that the partial preterist reading of the Olivet Discourse is not merely defensible, but compelling. Jonathan Z. Smith, in his study of comparative religion and institutional mechanisms, documented the processes by which religious institutions actively select which readings to propagate and which to suppress. This is not conspiracy. This is institutional logic. Institutions preserve what sustains them. They suppress what threatens them. And a 2,000-year-old red date on the apocalypse threatens the most effective source of doctrinal authority the Church has ever possessed. This is what Benary identified in 1830, what Rice confirmed through the mid-19th century, what Sproul acknowledged from within the mainstream in 1998. Not radical scholarship, not fringe interpretation. The carefully documented position that the text, read in its own historical context, has a clear and specific referent, and that referent is the first century. There is one more thing, and it is the thing Spinoza came back to more than any other question in his reading of the prophetic mode. If Revelation was written for the first century and fulfilled in the first century, what does that make the early Christians who lived through it? John of Patmos wrote to communities under persecution. He wrote to tell them that their suffering had meaning, that the power oppressing them would fall, that the hope they carried was not delusional. They were not waiting for something that might happen in 2,000 years. They were living through the thing the text described, and the text was telling them to hold, to endure, to resist. They held, they endured. The temple fell, Rome declined. The communities that John wrote to survived, transformed, and outlasted the empire that had tried to destroy them. The apocalypse did not end in terror and cosmic destruction. It ended in the survival of small communities of ordinary people who held to a vision of justice in the face of an overwhelming empire. That is what the text is about, not a future catastrophe, a first-century resistance documented, completed, and then systematically misread by the institution that inherited it. The text is not less powerful because it was fulfilled. It is more powerful because it was written by a real person in a real crisis to real people who needed real hope, not a theatrical prophecy designed to frighten future generations into compliance. A letter, a coded, urgent, precise letter sent to 7 communities on the coast of Asia Minor, telling them that the beast they feared was numbered, and that its number was the name of the man who had already killed the apostles, and that his time, like all tyrannies, would end. It ended. In 70 AD, documented by Josephus, anticipated by Jesus, encoded by John. And what the Church did with that, the transformation of a completed historical event into a permanent eschatological threat, is what Spinoza diagnosed in 1670 as the fundamental operation of institutional theology. Not error, not misunderstanding, the deliberate management of a text that, read honestly, releases its readers from the architecture of fear rather than imprisoning them inside it. You can read Revelation now the way John's original readers read it, as a text of resistance, written by people under persecution, for people under persecution, about an empire that was real and a hope that was earned. Or you can read it the way the institution needs you to read it, as a warning about a future catastrophe that may arrive at any moment, which only the institution is qualified to interpret and which only obedience can avert. Spinoza did not destroy Revelation. He returned it to what it was, a document of human courage in a specific historical moment, speaking truth to an imperial power, more honest than the eschatology of fear, more human, and for that reason, for Spinoza, more sacred. The ground is not collapsing, it is just not located where they told you it was. Take care of yourselves.
Before you go, think about what you just learned. Maybe it confirms what you already suspected. Maybe it challenges everything. Either way, sit with it. The truth needs time to settle. Stay curious.